I have sat on this bench for decades, long enough to watch arrogance parade itself in every form imaginable, long enough to recognize the subtle shift in the air when a person believes they are untouchable. And yet, even with all that experience weighing on my shoulders, even with the countless case files that have passed beneath my hands, nothing could have prepared me for the moment. Those heavy courtroom doors opened, and he walked in, not as a defendant burdened by the gravity of his actions, but as a man entering a private club he owned, his posture loose, careless, his chin tilted ever so slightly upward, as if the entire institution of justice existed merely to inconvenience him for a few hours. And I remember very clearly how the room changed, how the quiet murmurs faded into a tense, suffocating silence, how every pair of eyes followed him, not out of admiration, but out of disbelief. And from my bench, I watched, I observed, I measured, and in that very first instant, before a single word had been spoken, I knew this was going to be one of those cases. He was dressed impeccably, of course, a tailored suit that likely cost more than most people in that courtroom made in a year, the fabric catching the light in a way that seemed almost deliberate, his cufflinks gleaming, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. But it wasn't the wealth that struck me, it was the way he wore it, like armor, like a shield against consequence. His movements slow, almost bored, as if he had rehearsed this entrance, as if he had convinced himself that this was all a formality. And when he glanced up at me just briefly, just for a second, there was something in his eyes that made my grip on the gavel tighten ever so slightly, a flicker of amusement, of dismissal. And I remember thinking very clearly, I have seen this look before, and it never ends well. His father sat behind him, a titan in the business world, a name that carried weight, influence, power, the kind of power that bends systems, that whispers into ears behind closed doors, and I could feel the unspoken expectation in the room, the silent assumption that this case would follow a familiar script, that money would soften the edges, that connections would blur the lines. But I do not bend, I do not yield. And as I looked down at the file in front of me, thick, heavy, filled with details that would soon unravel his carefully constructed image, I felt that old, familiar steadiness settle within me, the kind that comes from years of watching truth claw its way to the surface, no matter how deeply it is buried. The charges were not complicated, at least not on paper. Assault, aggravated, against a 90-year-old veteran, a man who had served his country long before this boy had ever drawn his first breath. A man whose life had been defined by discipline, sacrifice, and quiet dignity. And yet the simplicity of the charge did nothing to lessen the weight of what had occurred. In fact, it made it heavier, more unbearable, because there is something profoundly disturbing about strength used against weakness, about youth turning its force against age. And as I began to read through the details, slowly, deliberately, I could feel the tension in the courtroom deepen, like a storm gathering just beyond the horizon. The incident itself had taken place outside a courthouse. Ironically enough, a place meant to symbolize justice, fairness, protection. And yet, in that very space, this young man had chosen to unleash his temper, his entitlement, his unchecked arrogance, all because the old veteran had dared to speak, dared to question, dared to exist in a way that inconvenienced him. And as the prosecutor began to lay out the sequence of events, step by painstaking step, I watched the defendant. I watched his face, searching for something, anything, a flicker of regret, a shadow of understanding. But there was nothing, just that same detached, almost amused expression, as if he were listening to a story that had nothing to do with him. Witnesses described the moment with unsettling clarity, the raised voice, the sudden shove, the way the old man stumbled, fragile bones unable to absorb the force, the sickening sound as he hit the ground. And I remember how the courtroom seemed to hold its breath as those details were spoken aloud, how even the faintest rustle of movement ceased, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. And still, the defendant sat there, leaning back slightly, one hand resting casually on the table, as if he were bored, as if this were beneath him. And I felt a slow, controlled anger begin to rise within me, not explosive, not reckless, but steady, deliberate, like a fire that knows exactly what it will consume. His lawyer, to his credit, attempted to intervene, to soften the narrative, to introduce nuance where there was none, to frame the incident as a misunderstanding, a moment of heightened emotion, a lapse in judgment. But even as those words were spoken, even as they floated into the air, fragile and insubstantial, I could see the cracks forming because the evidence was overwhelming, the testimonies consistent, the reality undeniable. And yet, the defendant could not help himself. He leaned forward at one point, interrupting, his voice carrying a sharp edge of irritation as he dismissed the accounts, as he questioned the credibility of those who had seen him. And I remember very clearly the way my gaze locked onto him, the way the room seemed to tighten around that single moment. I have seen defendants who deny, who deflect, who cling desperately to any version of reality that spares them from consequence. But this was different. This was not desperation. This was entitlement, pure and unfiltered, the kind that believes itself immune, the kind that assumes the rules do not apply. And as he spoke, as he attempted to justify his actions, to minimize them, to reduce a violent act to a trivial inconvenience, I could feel the weight of my responsibility pressing down on me, not as a burden, but as a reminder of why I sit on this bench, of why I have dedicated my life to this system. The victim's statement came next, and I remember bracing myself, not because I doubted my ability to remain composed, but because I knew instinctively that this would be the moment that would strip away any remaining illusions. And when the old man was helped to the stand, his movements slow, careful, each step a testament to the damage that had been done, the courtroom seemed to shrink around him, as if the walls themselves were leaning in, listening, bearing witness. And when he began to speak, his voice trembling, not with weakness, but with the weight of memory, of pain, of disbelief, I felt something shift within me. He spoke of the fall, of the confusion, of the sudden, overwhelming realization that he had been attacked, not by an enemy on a battlefield, not by a stranger in a dark alley, but by a young man in broad daylight, outside a place meant to uphold justice. And as he described the aftermath, the hospital visits, the lingering pain, the loss of independence, the fear that had crept into his daily life, I could see the impact etched into every line of his face. And I remember thinking, this is what arrogance does. This is what unchecked power looks like when it collides with vulnerability. Throughout it all, the defendant remained unchanged, unmoved, his expression fixed, his posture relaxed. And that, more than anything, was what began to push me toward the edge of my patience. Because I have always believed that remorse, genuine remorse, has the power to alter outcomes, to soften judgments, to remind us that even those who err are capable of growth. But there was none of that here, not even a trace, just that same infuriating detachment, as if the suffering being described were an abstract concept, irrelevant, distant, unworthy of his attention. By the time we reached the sentencing phase, the air in the courtroom was thick with expectation, heavy with the knowledge that something significant was about to occur, and I could feel every eye on me, waiting, watching, anticipating, and I allowed myself a moment, just a brief pause, to gather my thoughts, to ensure that what I was about to say would not be driven by anger, but by clarity, by purpose, by the unyielding principles that have guided me throughout my career. I leaned forward slightly, my hands resting firmly on the bench, my gaze fixed on the defendant, and when I began to speak, my voice was calm, measured. But there was an undercurrent there, a firmness that left no room for misinterpretation. And I remember saying very clearly that this court is not impressed by wealth, that it is not swayed by influence, that it does not bend to arrogance. And as those words settled into the silence, I could see the first flicker of uncertainty cross his face. I spoke of responsibility, of the fundamental expectation that those who possess power, whether financial, social, or physical, must exercise it with restraint, with awareness, with respect for others. And I made it abundantly clear that what had occurred was not a momentary lapse, not an unfortunate misunderstanding, but a deliberate act, a choice, one that carried consequences that could not and would not be ignored. And then I reached the point. The moment where words become action, where judgment takes form. And I delivered the sentence, maximum, without hesitation, without apology, because anything less would have been a disservice to the victim, to the system, to the very concept of justice. And as the reality of those words sank in, as they settled over him like a weight he could no longer shrug off, I watched the transformation unfold. Shock came first, A sharp, sudden widening of the eyes, a slight stiffening of the posture, as if his mind were struggling to reconcile what he had just heard with what he had expected. And then came the fear, creeping in slowly, replacing that earlier confidence, that careless arrogance, and finally the desperation, the pleas, the frantic attempts to undo what had already been done, but it was too late, far too late. The bailiff moved in, steady, unyielding, placing a firm hand on his arm, and for the first time since he had entered my courtroom, the defendant resisted, not physically, but emotionally, his voice rising, cracking as he begged, as he tried to invoke his father's name, his status, his connections, but none of it mattered, none of it held any weight in that moment, and as he was led away, his composure shattered, his arrogance stripped away piece by piece. I felt no satisfaction, only a quiet, resolute certainty that justice had been served. Months later, I would hear updates, fragments of information filtering through the system, the consequences of that sentence rippling outward, affecting not just him, but those around him, his father's influence diminished, his own future irrevocably altered, and I would think back to that day, to that moment when he walked into my courtroom believing himself untouchable. The victim, I was told, was recovering, slowly, steadily, finding a way to rebuild, to reclaim some sense of normalcy, and that, more than anything, was what mattered. Not the downfall of the arrogant, but the restoration of the wronged, the reaffirmation that justice, when applied with integrity, has the power to heal, to restore balance. I have presided over countless cases, each one leaving its mark in some way, each one adding to the weight of experience I carry with me. But this one remains, not because of its complexity, but because of its clarity, because it serves as a stark reminder of a truth that so many choose to ignore. And if there is one thing I have learned, one lesson that has been reinforced time and time again, it is this: justice does not care who you are, where you come from, or how much you have. It only cares about what you have done. Because in the end, arrogance may walk into my courtroom with confidence, but it always leaves in chains. Even now, long after the echoes of that gavel strike have faded from the walls of my courtroom, I can still see his face in that final moment before the doors closed behind him. I can still hear the faint, desperate tremor in his voice as it cracked under the unbearable weight of consequence. And I remember thinking, not with satisfaction, but with a kind of solemn clarity, that this was the moment his life divided itself into two distinct parts, before accountability and after it, and from my bench, where I have watched countless lives unravel and rebuild. I understood that what he had lost in that instant was not just freedom, but the illusion that had protected him his entire life. In the weeks that followed, fragments of his new reality began to surface in quiet reports and procedural updates, the kind that rarely carry emotion on their surface. But if you have done this job as long as I have, you learn to read between the lines, you learn to hear what is not being said. And what I saw was a young man struggling to exist in a world where his name no longer opened doors, where his wealth could not buy him comfort, where the cold, indifferent structure of consequence pressed in on him from all sides. And I wondered, not out of sympathy, but out of curiosity, whether he was finally beginning to understand. I remember one particular report, brief, almost clinical in its tone, noting his initial adjustment period, the resistance, the anger, the refusal to comply. And I could picture it so clearly, the same arrogance that had walked into my courtroom, now colliding violently with a system that does not tolerate defiance. And I imagined the slow erosion of that arrogance, not through force, but through repetition, through the unyielding consistency of rules that apply equally to all. And I found myself reflecting on how rarely people like him ever encounter that kind of reality. His father, of course, did not remain silent. Influence does not vanish overnight. It lingers. It attempts to reassert itself. And I was not surprised to hear of the legal maneuvers, the appeals, the quiet attempts to reduce, to mitigate, to reshape the outcome. But I was equally unsurprised when those efforts met the same immovable wall. Because once judgment is passed within the bounds of law and evidence, it stands not as a suggestion, but as a declaration. And I have always believed that the integrity of that declaration must be protected at all costs. Meanwhile, the old veteran's journey unfolded in a very different way, slower, quieter, but no less profound. And I recall reading updates about his recovery, about the physical therapy sessions, the gradual return of strength, the cautious steps toward independence. And there was something deeply humbling about it, something that stood in stark contrast to the chaos and resistance on the other side. Because where one life had been forced into accountability, the other was choosing resilience, choosing to rebuild despite the pain. There was a moment, months later, when he returned to the courthouse, not as a victim, but as a visitor, a man reclaiming a space that had once been associated with trauma. And I happened to see him briefly in the hallway, his posture still careful, his movements still measured, but there was a steadiness there, a quiet strength that had not been broken. And as our eyes met for just a second, he gave a small, respectful nod, and I returned it, understanding without words that justice, in its truest form, had done more than punish. It had restored something fundamental. Back in my courtroom, the cases continued, one after another, each with its own complexities, its own human dramas, its own moments of tension and resolution. But every now and then, I would find my thoughts drifting back to that day, to that young man who had walked in believing himself above it all, and I would ask myself whether the lesson had truly taken root, whether the experience had reshaped him in any meaningful way, or whether, given enough time, the old arrogance would attempt to reemerge. I have learned over the years that consequences alone do not guarantee change. They create the opportunity for it, but the choice ultimately belongs to the individual. And that is perhaps the most uncertain part of any judgment, the part that lies beyond the reach of the court, beyond the authority of the bench. And yet it is also the part that determines whether justice becomes merely an event or a turning point. There are nights when I sit alone long after the courthouse has emptied, the silence settling in like a heavy curtain, and I reflect on the weight of this role, on the decisions that ripple outward into lives I may never fully understand. And I think about cases like this one, where the line between right and wrong is so clear, so undeniable, and yet the human elements, the emotions, the histories, the choices make it anything but simple. And I remind myself again and again why I must remain steady, why I must remain fair, why I must never allow power or status to distort the scales. Because at the end of it all, beyond the verdicts, beyond the sentences, beyond the headlines and the whispered conversations, there is a truth that stands unshaken, a truth I have seen proven time and time again from this very bench, and it is this: a person can inherit wealth, can borrow power, can surround themselves with influence, but character is revealed only when none of those things can save them. There was one final update that reached my desk many months later, buried among routine paperwork, almost insignificant in appearance. And yet, as I read it, I found myself slowing down, reading each line more carefully than the last, because it described something I had not expected, not entirely. It spoke of compliance, of participation, of a noticeable shift in behavior, subtle at first, then more consistent, and I leaned back in my chair, the faint creak echoing in the quiet of my chambers, and I allowed myself a moment to process what that meant, not as a victory, not as redemption, but as the first fragile indication that perhaps, just perhaps, the reality he had been forced to face was beginning to take hold. I imagined him in that environment, stripped of the symbols that once defined him. No tailored suits, no polished shoes, no effortless authority, just another individual bound by the same rules as everyone else. And I wondered what it must feel like to confront oneself without the distractions of privilege, to sit with the memory of one's actions, not as a story told by others, but as a truth that cannot be escaped. And I thought about how rare that opportunity is. How many people go through their entire lives never truly facing the consequences of who they are. And I realized that, in a strange and difficult way, this was something he had been denied until now. And yet my thoughts did not linger on him for long, because my attention, my respect, my quiet admiration remained with the man whose life had been so carelessly disrupted, the veteran who had endured not just the physical impact of that moment, but the emotional aftermath, the erosion of safety, the intrusion of fear. into spaces that should have remained secure. And as I reflected on his journey, on his decision to stand, to speak, to face the process with dignity, I was reminded that true strength does not announce itself loudly. It does not demand recognition. It simply persists, steady and unyielding. I have said it before, and I will continue to say it for as long as I occupy this bench, because it is a truth that must be understood, deeply and without exception. In this courtroom and in the world beyond it, justice is not a commodity to be purchased. It is not a privilege reserved for the powerful. It is a standard, absolute, and unwavering. And those who walk through these doors believing they are above it will always, eventually, come to learn the same lesson: that the higher they stand on arrogance, the harder they fall into accountability.